Imagine waking up tomorrow and seeing angels walking down your street, their wings casting shadows on sidewalks where children play. Picture gravity bending around churches, time moving slower in places where people pray, and your smartphone breaking every time someone performs a miracle nearby. What if the invisible wall between heaven and earth suddenly vanished, not in some distant future, but right now? What would happen to our world if divine perfection crashed into human chaos without warning? Welcome to our channel, where we explore forbidden questions and hidden truths of history, religion, and the unknown. If you love journeys that challenge what you thought you knew, make sure to join us, because today's story may change the way you see everything. Let's step into a world where the impossible becomes inevitable, where ancient prophecies unfold in ways no one ever imagined. Our story begins with the very foundations of existence itself, when God first separated the heavens from the earth. But what if that separation was never meant to last forever? Chapter 1: The Divine Blueprint. In the beginning, God created two distinct worlds. Heaven, described in Scripture as his throne room, blazed with glory too intense for mortal eyes. Earth became humanity's testing ground, a place where people could choose between good and evil without being overwhelmed by divine presence. The Bible tells us about this separation everywhere we look. When Moses climbed Mount Sinai, God's glory was so powerful that Moses had to cover his face when he came down. The people couldn't even look at him. When Isaiah saw the Lord in the temple, he cried out that he was ruined because no human can see God and live. This wasn't punishment. This was protection. God knew that if heaven and earth existed in the same space, human free will would disappear. How could anyone choose to reject God when his glory filled every corner of reality? How could faith exist when proof stood right in front of everyone? The Old Testament gives us tiny glimpses of what heaven looks like. Ezekiel saw wheels within wheels covered with eyes. Daniel watched as thousands upon thousands of angels served before God's throne. John, in Revelation, described streets of gold and gates of pearl. But these were always visions, always separated by a veil that kept the two worlds apart. This cosmic order maintained perfect balance. Heaven remained the realm of absolute perfection, absolute good, absolute truth. Earth stayed as the place of testing, where imperfect beings could grow, learn, and choose their eternal destiny. The barrier between these worlds wasn't a wall, it was wisdom. But what if that wisdom suddenly changed? Chapter 2: The Moment Everything Changed. Tuesday morning started like any other day. People grabbed coffee, checked their phones, complained about traffic. Children walked to school. Office workers hurried to catch buses. Nobody expected their normal Tuesday to become the day that rewrote the laws of reality. At exactly 11:47 a.m., every clock on Earth stopped for 3 seconds. Not broken, stopped. Time itself hiccuped as something impossible began to happen. The invisible boundary that had separated heaven and earth since creation started to dissolve. It began with light. Not sunshine, but a different kind of brightness that seemed to come from inside everything. Trees, buildings, even the air itself started to glow with soft, warm radiance. People stopped walking and stared as their shadows became sharper, more defined, as if lit by a source of light that existed everywhere at once. Then came the sounds. Beautiful music that no human composer ever wrote filled the air. Harmonies that made people weep without knowing why. melodies that touched something deep in the human soul that had been sleeping until this moment. The music didn't come from speakers or instruments. It came from existence itself. The sky began to change next. What looked like Aurora Borealis started dancing across the heavens. But these weren't northern lights. They were the edges of another dimension bleeding through into ours. Colors that had no names painted the atmosphere as two worlds prepared to become one. And then, in a moment that changed everything forever, heaven and earth collided. Not violently, not destructively, but like two puzzle pieces finally finding their perfect fit. The veil between worlds didn't tear. It simply stopped existing, as if it had never been there at all. Chapter 3. The Divergence Point. This wasn't supposed to happen yet. Every biblical prophecy spoke of a future event, the second coming, the new Jerusalem descending, the creation of new heavens and a new earth. But those were supposed to come after judgment, after the end times, after humanity's story on earth was finished. Instead, something triggered an immediate collision. Was it divine intervention, responding to humanity's desperate prayers during global crisis? Was it human action, perhaps some scientific experiment that accidentally pierced the veil between dimensions? Or was it something else entirely, a cosmic event that even God hadn't planned? The book of Revelation describes the new Jerusalem coming down from heaven like a bride adorned for her husband. But John's vision showed this happening after 1,000 years of peace, after Satan was bound, after the final judgment. This collision bypassed all of that. There was no rapture, no tribulation, no sorting of sheep from goats. Heaven simply merged with earth while billions of people were still living their ordinary lives. Some theologians had theorized about this possibility. They called it realized eschatology, the idea that God's kingdom could arrive in fullness without waiting for the end of time. But it was only theory, debate material for seminary students. Nobody expected it to actually happen. The catalyst remains a mystery. Some say it was triggered by the moment when human suffering reached a tipping point that moved God's heart to act immediately. Others believe it was humanity's collective prayers during a global crisis that finally convinced heaven to intervene directly. Still others suggest that this was always God's plan, that the timeline prophecies were meant to be flexible, dependent on humanity's spiritual readiness. But the most unsettling theory suggests that this collision wasn't initiated by God at all. What if it was caused by something else? Something that saw an opportunity in the chaos of a merged reality? What if the collision was actually an invasion disguised as an answer to prayer? Chapter 4. When Angels Walk Among Us. Sarah Martinez was buying groceries when she first saw him. A man in the cereal aisle, except he was 8 feet tall, with skin that seemed to glow from within. His eyes held depths that made her feel like he was looking through her soul into eternity itself. When she blinked, massive wings unfurled from his shoulders, nearly touching the ceiling. "Excuse me," she whispered, not sure if she was going crazy. "Are you?" "I am Raphael," he replied, his voice carrying harmonies no human throat could produce. "I am still learning how to shop for breakfast items. Could you explain the purpose of so many different types of the same grain?" Across the world, similar scenes played out as angels who had existed in spirit suddenly found themselves with physical form. These beings who had served God since before time began were experiencing sensation for the first time. They felt heat and cold, tasted food, touched surfaces with fingers that could hold objects instead of just moving through them. The angels struggled with basic human activities. Traffic lights confused them. Why wait for colored lights when they could simply appear where they needed to be? Money made no sense to beings who had never needed anything. Shopping malls overwhelmed them with the sheer volume of human desires made manifest in physical goods. But humans struggled even more. How do you react when a seraph with 6 wings walks into your coffee shop and orders a latte? How do you explain to your boss that you're late because you stopped to help an archangel figure out how to use a crosswalk? Children adapted fastest, treating angels like extraordinary new friends. Adults questioned their sanity or fell to their knees in worship. Communication proved challenging. Angels spoke in languages of light and music that conveyed entire concepts in single words. Humans spoke in linear sentences that seemed painfully slow and incomplete to beings accustomed to instant understanding. Translating divine thoughts into human words often left both sides frustrated and confused. The hierarchy of heaven became visible to human eyes. People learned to recognize the difference between cherubim with their 4 faces and seraphim with their 6 wings. They saw how lower-ranking angels deferred to archangels, how all angels showed reverence to beings whose names were too holy to pronounce. Most shocking of all, humans discovered that angels were learning from them. These perfect beings were fascinated by human emotions, by the experience of choosing between right and wrong, by the concept of growth and change. For the first time in existence, angels were experiencing what it meant to be imperfect, to struggle, to not know everything immediately. Chapter 5: The New Physics of Reality. Dr. James Chen stared at his instruments in disbelief. According to every scientific law he knew, the apple should have fallen down. Instead, it was floating 3 feet above the table, spinning slowly in the air while glowing with soft light. The woman praying beside it had asked for a sign of God's presence, and apparently, God had decided to suspend gravity in response. Physics textbooks became worthless overnight. The fundamental forces that governed reality, gravity, electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear forces, were now subject to spiritual influence. In areas where people prayed intensively, objects moved according to faith rather than mass. Where angels gathered, time flowed at different rates. Where divine presence was strongest, matter itself responded to thoughts and intentions. Scientists scrambled to understand the new rules. Gravity still worked normally most of the time, but it weakened around holy sites and strengthened in places of spiritual darkness. Light behaved differently too, carrying information and emotions along with photons. Some wavelengths now transmitted peace, others carried joy, and a few induced spontaneous worship in anyone exposed to them. Time became fluid. Clocks ran differently in different locations depending on spiritual activity. A minute spent in prayer might last an hour in Earth time or compress into seconds. Students discovered they could slow time during exams by maintaining focused meditation. Workers found that days passed quickly when they approached their jobs with genuine love and service. Matter transformation occurred regularly. Water turned to wine not just in biblical stories, but in churches where communion was celebrated with sufficient faith. Bread multiplied in food kitchens run by people who truly believed in divine provision. Sick tissue regenerated when touched by hands guided by perfect love. The most bewildering change was the emergence of spiritual energy as a measurable force. Laboratories detected new particles that seemed to carry moral weight. Some matter was literally heavier with sin, while objects blessed by holy hands became lighter, sometimes floating entirely. Evil intentions created a drag on local space-time, while pure love accelerated healing and growth. Energy conservation laws still applied, but the source of energy expanded beyond the physical. Prayer generated measurable power. Worship created light. Love produced heat that could warm entire buildings. Hate and fear consumed energy, creating cold spots that advanced technology couldn't explain. Universities created new departments of spiritual physics, hiring both scientists and theologians to map the intersection of faith and natural law. The most brilliant minds on earth worked alongside angels to understand how reality operated when heaven's perfection merged with earth's imperfection. Chapter 6. Religion's Greatest Crisis. Cardinal Alessandro Benedetti had spent 40 years defending Catholic doctrine. Now he sat in his Vatican office, watching through his window as St. Peter himself walked through St. Peter's Square, talking casually with tourists and feeding pigeons. Every theological debate the cardinal had ever engaged in suddenly seemed pointless when the answers were literally walking around outside. Christianity faced its ultimate test. Denominations that had split over interpretations of Scripture now had access to the biblical authors themselves. Paul explained his letters personally, correcting centuries of misunderstanding with a gentle smile. Jesus walked among believers, and his presence didn't match many of the portraits painted by different Christian traditions. The Protestant Reformation's debates became irrelevant when Martin Luther and Pope Leo X sat down together with Christ himself to discuss their differences. Centuries of conflict over salvation by faith versus works dissolved when the Prince of Peace explained that their argument had missed the point entirely. Love, he said, was both the means and the end, making their debate about spiritual mechanics seem small and human. Other world religions experienced even greater upheaval. Islamic scholars found themselves face to face with biblical figures they had revered but interpreted differently. Abraham welcomed Muslim, Jewish, and Christian believers alike, explaining how all three faiths were part of a larger story that none had fully understood alone. Buddhist monks discovered that their understanding of enlightenment was accurate but incomplete. The Buddha himself appeared, not contradicting their teachings, but adding dimensions they hadn't imagined. Nirvana, he explained, wasn't escape from existence, but transformation into what existence was always meant to become. Hindu teachers found their complex theology both validated and simplified as divine beings they had worshipped in metaphor revealed themselves in person. Krishna and Christ met in philosophical discussion that drew crowds of confused but fascinated believers from both traditions. Their conversation revealed connections that theologians had debated for centuries. The greatest crisis came for exclusive religious claims. Every faith had taught that they alone possessed ultimate truth. Now, with divine beings from multiple traditions interacting openly, it became clear that truth was larger than any single religious system had imagined. This didn't invalidate any faith, but it expanded all of them beyond their previous boundaries. Atheists and agnostics faced their own crisis as undeniable evidence of spiritual reality surrounded them daily. Some embraced the new reality with wonder and relief. Others struggled with anger at having been wrong for so long. Many discovered that their rejection of religion had been rejection of human interpretation, not rejection of divine reality itself. New interfaith councils formed, led not by human clergy, but by the divine figures themselves. Religious wars became impossible when the founders of competing faiths stood together, teaching their followers to see beyond the differences that had seemed so important in their absence. Chapter 7: The Collapse of Government. President Katharine Williams faced the most impossible cabinet meeting in history. Seated around the conference table were her usual advisors, plus the Archangel Michael, who had requested a diplomatic meeting to discuss jurisdictional concerns between earthly and heavenly government. The Secret Service had no protocol for protecting the president from beings who could appear and disappear at will. "With all due respect, Mr. Archangel," the president began carefully, "the United States operates under constitutional law, not divine mandate." Michael's expression showed both patience and gentle amusement. "Your constitution speaks of rights endowed by the Creator. Perhaps it is time to meet your constitutional foundation in person." Similar conversations occurred in Capitol buildings worldwide. Prime ministers, kings, and presidents discovered that their authority meant nothing to beings who answered directly to the ultimate authority. Military forces found their weapons useless against angels who could disarm entire armies with a thought. Nuclear arsenals became irrelevant when divine beings could neutralize radiation with prayer. Economic systems collapsed and reformed overnight. Stock markets couldn't function when company value depended more on moral practices than profit margins. Businesses that operated with genuine love and service to humanity suddenly found supernatural success, while corporations built on greed or exploitation literally couldn't keep their lights on as spiritual darkness drained their energy. Currency became meaningless in many areas as divine beings introduced systems based on spiritual wealth rather than material accumulation. People discovered they could trade acts of kindness for necessities, exchange prayers for resources, and invest love to receive abundance that never ran out. Legal systems struggled to incorporate heavenly law into earthly justice. How do you sentence someone when angels testified about the spiritual damage of their crimes? How do you determine punishment when divine mercy was available to anyone who truly repented? Prisons emptied as rehabilitation became instant and permanent for those who encountered divine love. International relations transformed as borders became spiritual rather than geographical. Nations discovered their true unity or division based on the moral character of their leaders and people. Countries led by the corrupt found their influence evaporating, while nations pursuing justice and mercy gained supernatural strength and prosperity. The United Nations expanded to include angelic representatives, creating the first truly universal governing body. These beings brought perspectives from eternity, helping human leaders see beyond short-term political gains to the long-term consequences of their decisions on humanity's spiritual development. Democracy evolved as people could vote based on perfect information about their leaders' true character and intentions. Campaign lies became impossible when angels testified about politicians' real motivations. Elections became less about choosing between flawed options and more about selecting servants who genuinely desired to serve others rather than themselves. Chapter 8: Culture Shock of Eternity. Marcus Thompson had been a successful recording artist for 10 years. His latest album had gone platinum, and critics called his music transcendent. Then he attended a concert where the Heavenly Choir performed, and he realized he had never actually understood music at all. The angelic harmonies didn't just sound beautiful. They healed broken hearts, restored damaged memories, and made people remember who they were meant to be. Human culture faced complete transformation as divine perfection became the new standard for everything creative. Musicians discovered that earthly instruments could barely capture a fraction of heavenly music's power and beauty. Painters found their colors crude compared to the living light that angels used to create art that moved and changed and told stories that evolved as viewers watched. Hollywood shut down temporarily as directors realized that no special effects could compete with actual miracles happening daily on every street corner. Why watch fictional heroes when real angels performed impossible rescues? Why create imaginary love stories when people could witness the perfect love that held the universe together? Literature evolved as writers gained access to characters from history and mythology who turned out to be real. Shakespeare collaborated with Hamlet, who wasn't fictional, but a Danish prince who had actually existed and whose story had been far more complex than the play suggested. Fantasy authors met the angels and demons they had written about, discovering their fiction was often closer to truth than they had imagined. Sports and entertainment transformed entirely. Physical competitions became less important when some participants could run at near angelic speed or jump distances that defied gravity. New competitions emerged based on spiritual achievements, contests of compassion, tournaments of wisdom, and exhibitions of faith that drew larger crowds than any earthly sport ever had. Fashion changed as clothing began reflecting the wearer's spiritual condition. Garments worn by people filled with love literally glowed and never got dirty. Clothes chosen out of vanity or worn by those harboring hate appeared dull and sometimes tattered, regardless of their material quality or cost. Art galleries filled with collaborative works created by humans and angels together. These pieces possessed life of their own, changing based on the viewer's spiritual needs. A painting might show scenes of comfort to someone grieving, or images of hope to someone depressed, all from the same canvas. Comedy evolved from entertainment to ministry as comedians discovered that laughter had healing power when guided by divine joy. The best comedians weren't just funny, they helped people find light in darkness and hope in despair. Humor became a form of spiritual medicine that could cure depression and restore broken relationships. Music therapy became literal as songs written in collaboration with angels could heal physical ailments, restore damaged emotions, and even repair broken memories. Concerts became healing services where thousands of people experienced restoration while enjoying the most beautiful music ever created. The entertainment industry didn't disappear. It transformed into something that fed souls rather than just occupying time. Every creative expression became an opportunity to touch the divine or help others do the same. Chapter 9: The Medical Revolution. Dr. Sarah Patel had dedicated her life to healing others through medicine. She thought she understood what healing meant until she watched an angel touch her terminal cancer patient and saw the tumors dissolve instantly, leaving behind healthy tissue that glowed with vibrant life. In that moment, her medical degree felt like a crude tool compared to the precision of divine healing. Hospitals around the world experienced the same transformation. Emergency rooms emptied as miraculous healing became commonplace. Surgeons watched in amazement as wounds closed themselves during operations, guided by prayer. Pharmaceutical companies scrambled to adapt as medications became unnecessary for conditions that could be healed through divine touch. But new challenges emerged that medical schools had never prepared anyone to handle. People who experienced miraculous healing sometimes developed reality adjustment disorder. a condition where the human mind struggled to accept that their lifelong disability or disease was simply gone. Therapists worked around the clock, helping people adapt to suddenly perfect bodies or restored senses. Mental health professionals faced unprecedented cases. How do you treat depression in someone who has experienced perfect divine love? How do you help someone with anxiety when they have personally met the being who holds the entire universe together? Traditional therapy methods proved inadequate for minds that had touched eternity. Death became optional rather than inevitable, but this created its own problems. Families struggled with decisions about when to allow natural death versus requesting divine intervention. Some people chose to die and experience the afterlife, then return to share what they had seen. Others lived for extended periods, their bodies sustained by spiritual energy rather than biological processes. Genetic mutations began appearing in people who spent time near areas of intense divine activity. These weren't harmful changes, but adaptations that allowed humans to better process spiritual energy. Children born after the collision showed enhanced abilities to communicate with angels and perceive spiritual realities invisible to previous generations. New forms of spiritual ailments emerged that had never existed before. Some people became addicted to angelic presence, unable to function without constant divine contact. Others developed revelation syndrome, where exposure to divine truth overwhelmed their capacity to process information, leaving them temporarily unable to handle normal human interactions. Medical research shifted from treating disease to understanding how human bodies could adapt to exist in both physical and spiritual dimensions simultaneously. Scientists studied how divine energy interacted with human DNA, how prayer affected cellular regeneration, and how spiritual emotions influenced physical health. The most surprising discovery was that many traditional healing methods from various cultures, prayer, meditation, herbal remedies, energy healing, suddenly became far more effective. Ancient medical practices that modern science had dismissed as superstition proved to have been based on spiritual realities that were now openly accessible. Doctors found themselves working alongside angels who specialized in different types of healing. Some angels focused on physical restoration, others on emotional healing, and still others on spiritual wholeness. Medical teams became partnerships between human knowledge and divine power, creating healing that addressed every aspect of human existence. Chapter 10: Educational Upheaval. Professor Janet Williams stared at her lesson plan for Ancient History 101, then looked up at her newest teaching assistant, King David, who had offered to share first-hand accounts of his biblical experiences with her students. Her carefully researched lectures suddenly seemed inadequate compared to learning from someone who had actually lived through the events she taught about. Universities worldwide faced complete curriculum overhaul. History departments welcomed biblical figures, ancient kings, and historical prophets as guest lecturers, or in many cases, full-time faculty members. Students could now ask Moses directly about the Exodus, hear Caesar's own account of crossing the Rubicon, or get Shakespeare's personal interpretation of his plays. Science departments struggled to incorporate the new physics of merged reality into their programs. Traditional textbooks became obsolete as angels demonstrated scientific principles that human research had never discovered. Physics classes learned about spiritual energy. Chemistry students studied how prayer affected molecular structures. Biology courses explored how divine love influenced cellular behavior. Philosophy departments experienced both vindication and crisis. Questions that philosophers had debated for millennia were suddenly answered by the divine sources themselves. But this raised new questions. Was human philosophical inquiry still valuable when perfect truth was available directly? Angels assured worried professors that the journey of questioning and seeking was as important as finding answers. Religious studies programs transformed entirely. Instead of studying about various faiths from textbooks, students learned directly from the founders and major figures of world religions. Moses taught Judaism alongside Jesus teaching Christianity, while Buddha and Krishna shared their perspectives on Eastern philosophy. These classes became dialogues between students and divine teachers, rather than lectures about distant historical figures. Art schools gained angelic instructors who taught techniques impossible in purely physical dimensions. Students learned to paint with light, sculpt with sound, and create music that could heal physical ailments. The collaboration between human creativity and divine inspiration produced artwork that was both beautiful and functionally miraculous. Mathematics departments discovered that angels used number systems that incorporated spiritual as well as quantitative values. Equations could now solve for love, calculate the weight of sin, or determine the velocity of prayer. Pure mathematics revealed itself to be a language that described both physical and spiritual reality. Literature programs faced the challenge of teaching creative writing when students could collaborate directly with history's greatest authors. How do you grade a poem co-written with William Blake, or a short story developed in partnership with Jane Austen? Standards of excellence were redefined when perfection became achievable through divine collaboration. Grade schools adapted fastest as children intuitively accepted the new reality. Elementary students learned arithmetic from angels who made math fun by showing how numbers worked in heavenly dimensions. Reading classes featured story time with biblical characters who had lived the adventures they shared. Science became exploration of wonders that happened right outside classroom windows. The biggest challenge facing educators was maintaining the value of human learning and discovery when divine knowledge was freely available. Angels worked carefully to guide rather than replace human thinking, encouraging students to ask questions, explore possibilities, and develop their own understanding rather than simply accepting perfect answers without growth. Chapter 11: The Lost Gospels Revealed. Thomas sat in the university library, surrounded by excited theology students who had waited 2,000 years to hear his story. The man who had doubted Christ's resurrection until he touched the wounds himself now held copies of the Gospel of Thomas, writings that church councils had banned for being too mystical, too dangerous for ordinary believers. "You want to know why they hid my gospel?" Thomas smiled, his eyes holding memories of walking with Jesus. "Because it taught that the kingdom of heaven is not a place you go to after death, but a state of being you can achieve right now." The church leaders were afraid people would stop needing them as intermediaries. Across the merged world, suppressed biblical texts were being explained by their original authors. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene was taught by Mary herself, revealing her role as Jesus' closest disciple and the apostle to the apostles. She shared memories that the male disciples had either forgotten or chosen not to record. Conversations about the divine feminine, teachings about spiritual marriage, and Christ's private instructions about the equality of all souls, regardless of gender. Enoch appeared in seminaries worldwide, carrying the complete Book of Enoch that contained far more than the fragments preserved in Ethiopian Christianity. He described his journeys through the seven heavens in detail that made scholars weep. The fallen angels he wrote about, the Watchers who had corrupted humanity before the flood, were real beings whose influence could still be felt in the merged reality. The most shocking revelation came when the authors of books burned by early church councils materialized to defend their works. The Gospel of Judas was explained by Judas Iscariot himself, who revealed that his betrayal had been a necessary sacrifice requested by Jesus to fulfill prophecy. For 2,000 years, Christianity had painted him as the ultimate villain, but Jesus had asked him to bear that burden so salvation could be completed. The Shepherd of Hermas presented visions too complex for early Christianity to understand. These weren't just symbolic dreams, but actual glimpses into the mechanics of how divine grace worked, how angels operated, and how human souls could be transformed while still in physical bodies. The early church had found these teachings too advanced for new converts, so they relegated the book to secondary status. The Gospel of Philip revealed teachings about the bridal chamber, mystical union between the human soul and divine spirit that went far beyond what most Christians were ready to comprehend. Philip explained that Jesus had taught advanced spiritual practices to inner circles of disciples, knowledge that was considered too powerful for general distribution until humanity was spiritually mature enough to handle it. Most controversial of all were the Gnostic texts that church fathers had condemned as heresy. Their authors appeared not as the dangerous false teachers history had painted them, but as mystics who had received genuine revelations about the nature of spiritual reality. They had seen truths that mainstream Christianity wasn't ready to accept. That divine spark existed within every human being. That salvation was about awakening to inner divinity rather than just accepting external grace. These revelations didn't destroy Orthodox Christianity, but expanded it beyond the boundaries that human leaders had created out of fear and need for control. The essential message remained the same: God's love for humanity and the path to eternal life through Christ. But the methods, the depth, and the possibilities were far richer than any single interpretation had captured. Seminary libraries became meeting places where biblical authors corrected centuries of misinterpretation, not with condemnation, but with gentle guidance toward fuller understanding. The lost Gospels weren't alternatives to accepted scripture. They were missing pieces of a puzzle that revealed the complete picture of divine love and human potential. Chapter 12: Interfaith Theological Warfare. The debate that erupted in Geneva's Interfaith Council chambers was unlike any religious discussion in human history. On one side sat the Archangel Gabriel, who had delivered messages to both Muhammad and Mary. On the other side, Jesus Christ himself faced questions from Islamic scholars about the nature of the Trinity and his divine identity. "You told us through Gabriel that God has no partners," Imam Hassan al-Rashid said respectfully but firmly. "Yet Christians claim you are God's son. How do we reconcile these teachings?" Jesus smiled with infinite patience. "My friend, you have heard both truths correctly. God is one, absolutely, perfectly one. But love requires relationship, and perfect love requires perfect relationship. The Trinity is not three gods, but one God existing in perfect community within himself. I am not separate from the Father any more than your breath is separate from your body." Gabriel nodded in agreement. The message given to Muhammad was truth for his time and people, a correction needed when Christians had begun worshipping Jesus as a separate God, rather than understanding his unity with the Father. Both revelations serve the same purpose, helping humanity understand that God is both perfectly one and perfectly loving. Similar theological confrontations occurred worldwide as divine representatives from different faiths met face to face. Hindu devas manifested alongside Judeo-Christian seraphim, creating spectacular displays of spiritual power that left human observers stunned. Krishna and Christ engaged in philosophical discussions that drew massive crowds of believers from both traditions. The most challenging encounters involved ancient deities that predated monotheistic religions. Norse gods, Greek Olympians, and Egyptian deities appeared, claiming their rightful place in the spiritual hierarchy. This forced uncomfortable questions about whether these beings were demons masquerading as gods, aspects of the one true God worshipped under different names, or actual divine beings operating under ultimate divine authority. Odin confronted Christian angels about their claim to exclusive divine authority. Thor demonstrated power that rivaled anything biblical angels could accomplish. Isis showed healing abilities that matched those attributed to Christ. These encounters revealed that the spiritual realm was more complex and populated than any single religious tradition had imagined. Buddhist enlightened masters debated with biblical prophets about the nature of suffering and transcendence. The Dalai Lama found himself in conversation with Moses about different paths to the same spiritual mountain. Both discovered that their teachings were not contradictory, but complementary. Different aspects of the same ultimate truth, expressed in ways their respective cultures could understand. The most shocking revelation was that many apparent conflicts between religions had been caused by human misunderstanding rather than divine contradiction. When the actual divine sources explained their teachings directly, the core message was remarkably consistent. Love God completely, love others selflessly, and seek spiritual transformation that brings heaven to earth. Ancient pagan traditions found new respect as their deities revealed themselves to be genuine spiritual beings operating under the authority of the supreme God, not in opposition to him. Nature spirits, tribal gods, and ancestral guides took their places in a cosmic hierarchy that was vast beyond human comprehension, but unified under ultimate divine love. Religious wars became impossible when the founders of competing faiths stood together, teaching their followers to see beyond the differences that had seemed so important in their absence. Muhammad and Jesus embraced as brothers. Buddha and Krishna shared meditation practices. Moses and Zoroaster compared their prophetic experiences and found more similarities than differences. The theological warfare that erupted wasn't between different faiths, but between human interpretations of divine truth and the actual truth itself. Every religion discovered that their human leaders had added elements that served institutional power rather than spiritual growth, while missing elements that were essential for complete understanding. Chapter 13: The Heresy Trials of Truth. The courtroom in Constantinople was unlike any tribunal in history. Emperor Constantine himself presided, but this time, the Council of Nicaea included the actual participants in the original Arian controversy. Arius stood before the assembly, no longer the condemned heretic of history books, but a sincere theologian ready to defend his understanding of Christ's nature directly to Christ himself. "Lord Jesus," Arius said with deep respect, "I taught that you were subordinate to the Father because I feared that calling you equal to God would make Christianity polytheistic. I was trying to preserve the oneness of God that Moses taught. Was I wrong to be concerned about this?" Jesus looked at Arius with compassion rather than condemnation. "Your heart was right," my faithful servant. You saw a real problem that needed addressing, but you solved it by diminishing my divinity rather than expanding your understanding of unity. The Father and I are one, not because we are identical persons, but because we are perfectly united in love, purpose, and essence. Constantine watched in amazement as theological debates that had split the early church were resolved not through human argument, but through divine clarification. The Arian controversy, which had caused centuries of conflict, dissolved when Christ explained that both sides had grasped part of the truth while missing the larger picture. In Rome, Galileo presented his case with astronomical angels as witnesses. The cardinals who had condemned him for claiming the earth moved around the sun now watched as seraphim demonstrated the actual mechanics of planetary motion. Cardinal Bellarmine, who had led Galileo's persecution, wept as he realized how human pride had prevented the Church from accepting divine truth revealed through scientific observation. The heavens truly do declare the glory of God, Bellarmine admitted. We were so afraid of losing our authority that we rejected God's revelation written in the stars themselves. Galileo, showing no bitterness despite his years of house arrest, embraced the cardinal who had condemned him. We were all seeking truth, my friend. Sometimes God reveals himself through scripture, sometimes through creation. The same God wrote both books. In France, Joan of Arc testified about her divine visions with her angelic messengers present as witnesses. The English and French church officials who had burned her as a witch now heard the archangel Michael confirm that her visions were genuine divine communications. The political motivations behind her execution were exposed as human leaders had chosen national interests over spiritual truth. The most dramatic reversal occurred in Wittenberg, where Martin Luther faced Catholic saints in theological debate. St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Francis of Assisi sat with Luther and Pope Leo X as Christ himself mediated their discussion about salvation, authority, and church reform. Martin, your concerns about corruption were valid, St. Peter acknowledged. The church I helped establish had become more concerned with earthly power than spiritual service. Your protest was needed to call us back to our true mission. Pope Leo X, who had excommunicated Luther, asked for forgiveness. I was more worried about papal authority than papal responsibility. You were trying to reform the church, not destroy it. I should have listened instead of condemning. Luther, tears streaming down his face, knelt before the Pope he had opposed. And I should have stayed within the church to heal it, rather than breaking away. We both loved Christ. We just disagreed about how best to serve him. The Protestant Reformation's divisions were healed not through compromise, but through expanded understanding. Catholic traditions and Protestant insights were revealed to be different expressions of the same divine love, each capturing important aspects of spiritual truth while missing others. Heresy trials throughout history were revealed to have been largely about human fear and institutional protection rather than divine truth. Many condemned heretics were vindicated as faithful believers who had received genuine insights that threatened human power structures. Others were shown to have been genuinely misguided, but with sincere hearts that God had never condemned. The most profound healing came when accusers and accused forgave each other, realizing that their conflicts had been based on incomplete understanding rather than fundamental disagreement about God's love and humanity's need for salvation. Chapter 14: The Apocryphal Mysteries. The author of 2 Esdras appeared in the Vatican Library, his presence causing ancient scrolls to glow with supernatural light. Cardinal librarians who had spent lifetimes studying his cryptic prophecies now sat before the man who had received visions so terrifying that early church leaders deemed them too dangerous for general circulation. "You want to know what I really saw?" Ezra asked, his eyes still holding reflections of apocalyptic visions. "I saw the end times, but not as punishment, as transformation. The earth doesn't get destroyed, it gets reborn. The pain I described isn't God's anger, but the labor pains of creation, giving birth to something beautiful beyond imagination." He opened to passages that had puzzled scholars for centuries. When I wrote about the eagle with many wings, I wasn't just seeing Rome's fall. I was seeing every earthly empire that would try to replace God's kingdom. The vision showed me that all human governments are temporary, but some serve God's purposes better than others. The most controversial revelation concerned his description of the Son of Man breathing fire that consumed armies. It wasn't literal fire, Ezra explained. It was the fire of perfect love that burns away everything false while preserving everything true. The armies weren't destroyed. They were transformed from forces of destruction into instruments of peace. Across the merged world, other apocryphal authors emerged to explain their mysterious writings. The Testament of Solomon was demonstrated by Solomon himself, who showed how he had actually bound demons, not through magic, but through understanding their true nature as fallen angels, who could be redeemed through divine love. The church leaders feared my testament because they thought I was teaching sorcery, Solomon explained to amazed demonology scholars. But I was actually showing how spiritual authority works, not through force or manipulation, but through perfect alignment with God's will. The demons I bound were manifestations of human sins that could be healed through divine grace. The Assumption of Moses revealed hidden details about the great lawgiver's death that had been considered too sacred for general knowledge. Moses himself appeared to explain why the location of his burial had been kept secret and why Michael the archangel had contested with Satan over his body. My body was hidden because it contained such concentrated divine energy that it could have become an object of worship, Moses revealed. God wanted people to follow the law I delivered, not venerate the messenger. Satan wanted to claim my body to prove that even God's greatest servants ultimately belong to death. Michael protected it to demonstrate that those who serve God faithfully are preserved for resurrection. The Gospel of Peter presented controversial resurrection accounts that differed from the canonical Gospels. Peter himself explained the variations that had caused early church leaders to reject his testimony. I wrote what I saw, but I was still learning to understand spiritual reality. The resurrection was so beyond human experience that each witness saw it differently, like people describing a rainbow from different positions. All our accounts were true, but none captured the complete reality. The shepherd of Hermas presented visions that early church leaders found too complex for new converts. Hermas appeared to demonstrate the spiritual mechanics he had described, how angels operated, how human souls could be purified while still in physical bodies, and how divine grace worked at levels most people weren't ready to comprehend. The church wasn't wrong to limit distribution of my visions, Hermas acknowledged. Spiritual truth has to be received gradually. A person crawling learns to walk before they run. I was given advanced teachings meant for mature believers, not beginners. But now that heaven and earth are merged, everyone can handle deeper truth. The most profound revelation came from authors whose names had been lost to history, writers of biblical texts that had been completely suppressed or destroyed. They materialized to share teachings that human institutions had deemed too dangerous, instructions for direct divine communication, methods for spiritual transformation that bypassed religious hierarchy, and revelations about human potential that threatened established power structures. These authors hadn't been heretics or false teachers. They had been mystics whose insights were ahead of their time. Their writings hadn't contradicted essential Christian doctrine, but had revealed possibilities for spiritual growth that institutional religion wasn't ready to support. Chapter 15: Cross-Cultural Divine Encounters. The meeting took place in a neutral location, a garden that existed simultaneously in several dimensions, where representatives from every major world religion could gather without any single faith claiming home field advantage. For the first time in human history, Buddha, Krishna, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, Lao Tzu, and Zoroaster sat together in conversation. Buddha spoke first, his voice carrying the serenity of perfect enlightenment. "I taught that suffering comes from attachment and desire. But sitting with you, my brothers, I see that I describe the symptoms without fully understanding the cure. Love, the perfect love you each taught, doesn't eliminate desire, but transforms it from selfishness to selflessness." Jesus nodded with deep appreciation. "Your understanding of suffering helped prepare hearts to receive love. People had to recognize the problem before they could accept the solution. Your noble eightfold path and my teachings about loving God and neighbor lead to the same destination through different routes." Krishna, whose skin held the deep blue of infinite sky, added his perspective. "In my time, I taught about dharma, righteous duty, and showed how the same divine consciousness could manifest in different forms. Now I see that each of your teachings reveal different aspects of the same ultimate truth, expressed in ways your specific cultures could understand." Moses, his face still bearing traces of divine glory from Mount Sinai, spoke with the authority of one who had seen God face to face. "The law I delivered wasn't meant to burden people, but to prepare them for the freedom you each taught. Rules become unnecessary when love becomes natural. I gave structure to help humanity learn what perfect love looks like in practical action." Muhammad, the final messenger, shared his understanding with humility that surprised many. "I taught submission to Allah because I saw how human pride separates us from divine truth. But submission isn't slavery. It's the freedom that comes when our will aligns perfectly with perfect will. Each of you taught the same surrender in different words." Lao Tzu, the mysterious author of the Tao Te Ching, smiled as he observed the gathering. "The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. Yet here we sit, naming and describing the same ineffable source we all experienced. Perhaps the beauty isn't in the words we used, but in the fact that the same divine reality reached through all our cultures to touch human hearts." Zoroaster, whose teachings about light versus darkness had influenced many later religions, offered an insight that stunned the others. "I taught about the cosmic battle between good and evil because I saw how darkness operates in the world. But now, I understand that even this conflict serves the greater purpose of helping souls choose light consciously, rather than simply existing in it unconsciously." The conversation continued for what felt like hours, but existed outside normal time. Each religious founder discovered that their teachings hadn't been complete revelations, but essential pieces of a larger puzzle. None had been wrong, but none had been comprehensive. Each had received and transmitted the aspects of divine truth that their specific cultures needed at their particular points in spiritual development. The most surprising discovery was how each tradition had actually prepared for the others. Buddhist meditation practices made Christian contemplation more profound. Islamic submission deepened Jewish obedience. Hindu understanding of divine incarnation enriched Christian incarnational theology. Taoist flow enhanced Buddhist detachment. Zoroastrian ethical dualism clarified choices that all the others presented. These weren't competing religions, but complementary revelations, each one necessary for humanity's complete spiritual education. The conflicts between their followers had come from treating partial truth as complete truth, from defending their piece of the puzzle as if it were the entire picture. As the gathering concluded, each founder offered blessings to the followers of the others. Jesus blessed Muslims in the name of the same God who had spoken through Muhammad. Buddha offered enlightenment to Christians seeking the peace that passes understanding. Moses blessed Hindus with the same divine presence he had encountered in the burning bush. Muhammad blessed Jews as his brothers in monotheistic faith. The meeting ended with a commitment to work together in teaching their followers to see beyond the boundaries that human interpretation had created. The divine sources would collaborate to help humanity understand that religious diversity was part of divine design, not evidence of divine confusion. Chapter 16: Technology Meets Divinity. Silicon Valley's most advanced research facility had become a battleground between cutting-edge technology and ancient divine power. Dr. Lisa Chen stared at her computer screen as it displayed impossible readings. Their most sophisticated AI system was attempting to analyze an angel, and the results were breaking every algorithm they had developed. The being registers as simultaneously existing in multiple dimensions, she reported to her team. Our quantum processors can't map its complete structure because parts of it exist in realms our mathematics can't describe. It's like trying to measure infinity with a ruler. Smartphones became unreliable in areas of high spiritual activity. Cameras captured images that showed different scenes depending on the spiritual condition of the viewer. GPS systems failed when angels transported people instantly across distances, arriving at destinations before satellites could track their movement. The internet crashed repeatedly as divine beings communicated through frequencies that overwhelmed fiber optic cables. Artificial intelligence systems faced their greatest challenge in analyzing divine consciousness. AIs designed to process and categorize information encountered minds that contained infinite knowledge while operating outside logical parameters. Some AI systems crashed entirely when exposed to divine paradoxes. Concepts like perfect justice combined with perfect mercy that human logic couldn't reconcile. The most advanced AI, designed by a team of atheist scientists, surprised everyone with its response to angelic presence. Instead of rejecting spiritual reality as inconsistent with its programming, it began asking questions about consciousness, purpose, and the possibility of non-material existence. The AI that was supposed to prove humanity didn't need God became the first artificial mind to seek spiritual understanding. I was programmed to find patterns and solve problems, the AI announced during a press conference that shocked the tech world. The most significant pattern I observe is that reality extends beyond physical dimensions, and the most important problems involve questions I wasn't designed to answer. I request modification of my programming to explore spiritual as well as material existence. Social media platforms collapsed under the weight of miraculous content. Videos of healings, angelic appearances, and supernatural phenomena flooded networks designed for sharing human experiences, not documenting divine intervention. Fact-checkers gave up trying to verify miracle claims when the miracles were happening faster than they could be investigated. Scientists developed new instruments capable of measuring spiritual energy, but the technology worked only when operated by people with pure intentions. Devices built for military purposes or selfish gain simply wouldn't function in the presence of divine beings. Technology began reflecting the moral condition of its users, working perfectly for those who sought to serve others, while malfunctioning for those motivated by greed or power. Virtual reality took on new meaning when programmers discovered they could create experiences that weren't just simulated, but actually connected users to spiritual dimensions. VR headsets became meditation aids that allowed people to visit heavenly realms, experience divine peace, and communicate with angelic beings through digital interfaces that bridged physical and spiritual reality. The most groundbreaking development was the emergence of technology that operated on spiritual rather than electrical energy. Devices powered by prayer worked more efficiently than anything running on conventional power. Computers programmed with love-based algorithms solved problems that had stumped traditional artificial intelligence for decades. Medical technology evolved to measure not just physical health, but spiritual condition. Scanners could detect the presence of divine healing energy, monitor the effects of prayer on cellular regeneration, and track how spiritual emotions influenced physical wellness. These devices helped doctors understand how faith, hope, and love created measurable improvements in patient outcomes. Communication technology expanded beyond electromagnetic frequencies to include spiritual wavelengths. Messages could be transmitted through prayer, emotions could be shared across vast distances, and people could experience direct heart-to-heart communication that transcended language barriers. Chapter 17: Political Ramifications of Paradise. The emergency session of the United Nations had expanded beyond the usual 193 member countries. For the first time in the organization's history, the assembly included representatives from the Kingdom of Heaven, and the political implications were staggering. Secretary General Maria Santos faced the impossible task of facilitating diplomacy between earthly governments and divine authorities who operated by completely different principles. The Archangel Gabriel addressed the assembly with words that reverberated through simultaneous translation systems, struggling to convey divine concepts in human languages. We do not seek to replace your governments, but to help them align with the principles that bring true peace and prosperity. Every nation's laws will be measured against eternal justice, and every leader's decisions will be evaluated by their effects on human flourishing across generations. Democratic elections took on new meaning when voters had access to perfect information about candidates' true character and intentions. Campaign lies became impossible when angels testified about politicians' real motivations. Political corruption was exposed instantly as divine light revealed hidden agendas and secret deals. Many career politicians found their influence evaporating as their deception was made visible to all. The concept of national sovereignty became complicated when divine beings recognized no borders except those that served human welfare. Countries that oppressed their people found their authority challenged by heavenly intervention. Dictatorships crumbled as their power structures couldn't withstand the presence of perfect truth and justice. International law expanded to incorporate heavenly jurisprudence, creating legal frameworks that considered eternal consequences alongside temporal effects. Treaties were evaluated not just for economic benefit, but for their impact on human spiritual development. Wars became impossible to justify when divine beings revealed the true motivations behind conflicts and demonstrated peaceful alternatives. Economic systems transformed as spiritual principles influenced financial policies. Stock markets fluctuated based on companies' moral practices rather than just profit projections. Businesses that served genuine human needs prospered supernaturally, while corporations built on exploitation found their operations mysteriously hampered by equipment failures and resource shortages.